My name's Ed Gillespie. I am what I describe as a recovering sustainability consultant. I've worked in sustainability for about 20 years. But what I'd like to sort of talk to you a little bit about today is the idea of slow travel and conscious travel. About 2007, 2008, I did a global circumnavigation of the planet, which is easy for me to say, without getting on a plane. That resulted in this book, Only Planet, a flight-free adventure around the world. And in essence, what that trip was about was a climate change pilgrimage, if you like. I wanted to go traveling, but I didn't want to leave a planet-stewing slew of carbon emissions in my wake whilst doing so. So I opted to do it all overland and by sea. And the book describes the adventures. It's 31 different countries, I think, 381 days, something like 45,000 miles, I think I covered. And it's quite a kind of a human-focused journey, because it's all about the people and the characters and the personalities I met along the way, and also the wonderful ecological background and the challenges that I confronted. And the idea behind the book was that the journey is the reward. It's a kind of cliched old Zen proverb. And this idea that it was about a romantic seduction, this slow transition of landscape, culture, people, language, and cuisine, rather than the sort of wham bam, thank you, ma'am, or the knee trembler behind the bike sheds of a cheap flight. And it was about kind of discovering the joys of a slower, more ruminative, reflective, more connected way of traveling around the world. So it feels like the dim and distant past in some ways. The book was published about 7 years ago in 2014. And I think it's become even more sharp and even more timely in the aftermath of the pandemic, or in this tail end of the pandemic, because clearly all of our travel was dramatically disrupted as we all got locked down, and we all managed to kind of cope with that, both personally and professionally, in some way, shape, or form. Now, it's not easy when you're being made to stay at home, but certainly in terms of the pivot that had to be made in terms of our professional lives and the connections, we've done it. You know, as a consultant, I used to get invited to speak all over the world. And I was quite pushy, even back in the early noughties. Well, I would say to people who wanted me to, you know, fly across the Atlantic to give a 20-minute talk, I'd say, that's insane. I said, I'm not going to do that, but if you give me the money that you were going to spend on my flight and hotel, I'll make you a very professional film of my presentation. I'll dial in for the live Q&A after it. You'll have an asset that you can then go and use before and after the event to promote it. And also, I haven't burnt several tons of carbon in order to get myself there. So I was doing that way back in the day to avoid what I considered to be, you know, unnecessary travel. And I think that's where we are now. You know, we had the interruption of the commute, you know, this cumulative, burgeoning insanity of literally tens of millions of people traveling for hours every day in confined, cramped, claustrophobic and uncomfortable conditions. Also insanitary, as anyone who's traveled on the London Tube or a bus and picked up their winter cold will know, even pre-COVID. And perhaps it was only the type of intervention that we've just had when we've been forced to curtail that type of activity that we get a chance to take a step back and look at it in a more objective way. So I think we also need to check ourselves on our international travel. Now, we were in the era of cheap flights, and the airlines are going to be falling over themselves to try and get us back in the air as soon as they possibly can, because of the huge financial challenge that they now currently face. I think we should resist that temptation. And I want to just outline 3 different threads to this particular argument. One is the need to travel, because pre-COVID, we were existing in an age of hypermobility. with the idea that we had the right to twang ourselves wherever we wanted, whenever we wanted, however frequently wanted, and kind of hang the consequences. And this was the phenomena, of the mini break, where we'd pop over to some European city for 2 days and justify that because we deserved it. I've already talked about the commute, but also the fact that that wasn't actually giving us a lot of pleasure. Now, I think we need to address that need to travel head on. We're thinking very smart now about our ability to run workshops all over the world, which means consultants in particular don't have to be there in person. We've done that very effectively. We've achieved the impossible. I was always told this couldn't be done in my previous consultancy life, and we've all managed to segue relatively seamlessly and become intimately familiar with the world of Microsoft Teams and Zoom and all those other platforms. So the need to travel can totally be addressed, because I think we should see carbon as a very precious resource that we only squander in very wise and essential ways. So rather than flying for that business meeting, we should be saving that carbon for perhaps the trip of a lifetime, where we do our one international flight every few years. Because when you look at the stats for the UK, it's quite striking, because about 70% of UK flights are taken by 15% of the population. And that's people with money, and usually with professional roles which require them to travel. So the demand management is quite simple in that sense. It's like we stop the binge flyers, we cut the binge flyers down, because it's not your average hardworking British family taking their one summer holiday per year that is the aviation challenge. It is the frequent flyers. And initiatives like the frequent flyer levy, which suggests that we should have a ratcheted tax where everyone gets one tax-free flight per year, but for every subsequent flight you take, you pay a higher and higher premium, would totally address that. Because at the minute, what we have is a wealthy elite flying multiple times, and half the people in the UK don't fly in any one year. So the first thing is about tackling that need to travel. The second thing is doing as I did, traveling slower and overland. And one of the things that's really beautiful is the sort of renaissance of the train, and the renaissance in particular of the sleeper train network across Europe, which off the back of the pandemic and in the face of the climate change challenge is seeing massive reinvestment. So you can pretty much get anywhere in Europe within 24 hours. Austria is positioning itself as the kind of European sleeper train hub to give access to both the east and west extremes of Europe. There'll be a new sleeper train starting up in the next year or so between Stockholm and London. And I personally have done dozens of these transcontinental journeys across Europe. In fact, one of the things that I invested in when I came back from my Only Planet adventure was Loco2, which is now Rail Europe, which was a European rail ticketing platform which made it as easy to buy a European train as a European plane. So it would basically allow you to do your Birmingham to Barcelona journey in one transaction. And now I've also just invested in another business called Byway, which is trying to bring these seamless train journeys into a much more accessible and package type format. So actually selling people whole itineraries based on the train as you travel through the world and across Europe. I think the other thing is also to think, as we also are in the end of the pandemic, about the staycation and about traveling closer to home. If you're UK based, you're blessed with living on a perversely diverse little group of islands, which have an extraordinary range of landscapes, fantastic regional cultures that many of us are actually completely ignorant of and haven't bothered to go and check out. I always used to challenge people who couldn't wait to fly to New Zealand and who hadn't ever been to Scotland. So I think this traveling overland and by train is really important, because it's the quality of the experience that counts. And when you travel by train in Europe, you see things like the fact that German trains have mini boardrooms on them. You can actually book all of your colleagues into a separate little compartment and have a meeting whilst you're en route. And I think this idea that travel time is wasted time comes from our obsession with flight. in the fact that, you know, we're used to trying to balance the laptop on our knees in the airport departure lounge, trying to work on the plane like this, you know, and it feels like very unproductive time. Whereas actually on the train, you've got space. Plus, you know, you can behave like a grown-up on a train. On a plane, I always talk about the infantilization of flight, which is sit there, buckle up, don't move, watch this, eat that, you know, and just behave yourself for the duration of the journey. Trains have far more potential to be naughty and independent and go and mess around and do silly things en route. You know, you're not condescended to on a train. So there's addressing the hypermobility and the need to travel. Secondly is to do it in the dramatically lower carbon and more relaxed fashion of traveling overland and slow. And the third one is about the incentivization. How do we encourage people to do this? Now, partly that might be through things, like I said, like the frequent flyer levy on aviation, but also leveling the playing field. We don't have fuel tax on aviation either, which means planes are often cheaper than their train-based counterparts. What I previously did in my old agency was introduced for my colleagues what we call the slow travel holiday policy, which meant that if you opted to take your European holiday by train instead of a plane, we would give you an extra days of annual leave in order to compensate for the supposedly lost time of the journey. And I think all of us should be looking at how we have to address the carbon intensity of our travel. You know, we're on a journey now collectively to net zero, and we are all going to be cutting our carbon emissions by 50% by 2030, which is the easy bit, the first 50%. And that includes everything. And unfortunately, carbon footprint tends to be almost directly correlated with income. So if you are a high earner, which in the UK is anything over 40K a year, then you are in the top 10% of people with the highest carbon footprints in the UK. And so you need to be planning how you are going to cut your carbon footprint by 50%. And so we address hypermobility, we travel overland, and we incentivize it in the right way. And I think for me, this is about a shift in consciousness, about that travel is a privilege. It's not a right. You know, it is something that you cannot do at the expense of the rest of the world for your own personal gratification. At the same time, travel is also a beautiful and profoundly important thing about intercultural connection and the entangled lives in which we live. So if you read the book, you know, some of the stuff I talk about is also, if you like, the qualitative benefits of the experience. Mark Smith, the man in seat 61, who's done so much to promote European train travel and actually international train travel, always says you should never travel without a good book and a corkscrew, which is great advice in any context, but it works particularly well on a train when you've got this ever-rolling and ever-changing landscape passing by your huge window next to you. But also it's about the places in between and the people you meet in between along the way. There's something inherently convivial about sitting on a train, often because you're sat opposite each other, so you get to talk rather than sat in a row on a plane next to a fat man eating off a plastic tray. And it's about the schadenfreude as well. I also think there's something to be said about the stories we tell about the travel adventures we have. And no one wants to hear about your 2 weeks next to the infinity pool sipping cocktails, you know, and your flight experience. But everyone wants to hear about when you nearly got arrested by Chinese border guards crossing into China from Mongolia, because it's the schadenfreude of the travel stories that are the things that we will end up relating as our well-worn anecdotes in years to come. So, I mean, I can talk about this for hours, as you've probably gathered, and I'm sad that I can't be joining you for the live conversation. But I think, in essence, this is a huge moment in time for reimagining and reinventing the purpose and the practice of the way we travel. As I say, it's not to throw the baby out with the bathwater and give up traveling, but it's to do it in a way which aligns with our planetary challenges. And to do it in a way which enhances the quality of the experience at the same time. That's what conscious travel is about on one and our only planet.